Welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us on At Issue. My name is H. Wayne Wilson, and we're going to be defining free speech. We all know what free speech is, First Amendment right. But when it comes to politics, what is free speech, and how does money impact free speech? We're going to be discussing that with a couple of people who have been very kind to drive down from Chicago to the Peoria studios. Both of them drove down here just for this discussion. So we're going to say thank you first to Dave Melton.
My pleasure.
Dave is the executive director of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. Correct. Based in Chicago.
Correct.
Thank you very much for being with us. And also Jacob Huebert has driven down here. He is the lead attorney for the Liberty Justice Center, located in the Windy City. So thank you for being with us.
Sure, happy to be here.
And let's start with just some background, and I'll let you lead us off here, Jacob, with, can you tell us a little bit about, I believe it was 2009 that Senate Bill 1466 was passed. Can you just lay out what that defined?
Yeah, the most important thing that Senate bill did was to create a system of campaign contribution limits in Illinois. And it limits what everybody, or almost everybody, can give to candidates and other kinds of political committees in Illinois. So for example, if an individual wants to give money to a candidate, they can give up to $5,000 worth. If a corporation or an association or a union wants to give money to a candidate, they can give up to $10,000. If a political action committee wants to give money to a candidate, they can give up to $50,000. But if the political parties or their leaders in the General Assembly want to give money to a candidate, they can actually direct as much money as they want to the candidates of their choice. And that's what we would argue is a problem with that. But the basic idea is this is a system that limits how much almost everyone in Illinois can give to the candidates of their choosing and the other political committees of their choosing.
Is that a fair assessment of what the law?
That's a fair description of the limits. And I would just point out that this parallels the kind of system that was put in place at the federal level in the 1970s. It took Illinois a little longer to get there because we had to go through the Rod Blagojevich scandal in order to, which is what really pushed and motivated the passage of this bill in 2009, 1 year after Rod Blagojevich was arrested.
Before we discuss the merits of that particular bill, one other aspect of that, and I'd like you to address that if you would. It created a task force.
It did create a task force which was tasked with looking at various issues. Most of them were turned out to be fairly technical, related to very specific provisions of the bill. But there was one issue on which the task force was asked by the statute to look at the possibility of going to a public financing system of some form here in Illinois. The task force did subsequently prepare a report, but they couldn't reach any kind of agreement, and they ended up just basically surveying sort of the state of the law and the state of what other people are doing, and making some suggestions for 4 different possible systems that Illinois could conceivably adapt or look into, but they didn't take any position or issue anything definitive with a recommendation.
And technically they still exist till after the 2014
They do
election.
still exist, and they're also charged with looking at the how the limits are working in the context of Illinois elections.
So there's a primer on that Senate bill and the laws that exist until Illinois Liberty PAC came along and said, I don't think the law is right, and they challenged it.
Right, so we have a lawsuit in which we're representing Illinois Liberty PAC and a donor who wants to give money to candidates and a candidate who wants to receive money from donors, and we're challenging that system of limits. Challenge is in progress, so nothing's happened to the law yet. It's still in place, still being enforced as it's written. But our challenge says that this system of limits isn't constitutional, it isn't fair, because it lets those political party leaders, the 4 top people in the General Assembly, direct as much money as they want to the candidates of their choice while limiting everybody else. And the result is not a system that limits corruption, but a system that gives those particular people political power like nobody else has in this state to greatly influence who gets elected into office. It would be one thing to have an even set of restrictions, but this is grossly uneven because it puts these particular particular people in a position to influence elections in a way that nobody else can. And it also discriminates in other ways too. I mentioned earlier, if you're an individual, you can give up to $5,000 to the candidate of your choice. But if you're a corporation, you can give $10,000 to the candidate of your choice. It doesn't make any sense that corporations can give twice as much. Are corporations less likely to corrupt with their donations than individuals? I don't think most campaign reformers would say that. So it really doesn't make sense, and it really gives powerful interests more power and restricts ordinary people. And that's why we're challenging it.
Let me put a little different spin on that. The set of limits that were adopted in terms of differentiating between what the political parties can give and what individuals and so on can give was modeled on the federal system, which also allows political parties to direct more money to candidates than other people. The Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld the propriety of doing so and the constitutionality of it. And that's why in this very case, this trial judge has already indicated twice in written opinions that he thinks there is little or no merit to the plaintiff's contentions attacking this system. And ultimately, the validity of the Illinois limits, we hope, will be upheld. And just fair disclosure, we have filed amicus briefs in the case urging the court to uphold the constitutionality of these limits. We think that what's really going on here is that people are using, like the Liberty Pact, are trying to use the First Amendment as an excuse to actually increase the power of special interests, and particularly moneyed interests, in our political system, and that is an evil that we need to fix and address.
Well, there's a couple of things to say in response to that. One is, when he says that political parties can give as much as they want to candidates, and that's just like the federal system, it's not quite the same, because Illinois law defines political parties in a funny way. It doesn't just include the Republican Party and the Democratic Party of the state, as you would think of them. It also includes what the law calls legislative caucus committees. And those are special committees that those four people I mentioned, Speaker Mike Madigan, Senate Leader John Cullerton, the two Republican leaders, they have these special committees that are also allowed to give as much as they want. So it's not just the political parties, it's also these individuals' particular committees. And they can take in money from all the special interests they want, and they can pool it together, and they can direct that at the candidates they favor. Nobody else in the state can do that.
Look, if I could, the legislative caucus type system has existed in the U.S. Congress for a long time. We have a democratic senatorial campaign where senators get together, they raise money jointly to try and elect Democratic senators in Congress. Republicans have the same kind of committee in Congress, same kind of thing in the House in Congress at the federal level. The legitimacy of those limits has never been questioned by the Supreme Court, and there's no reason to think that this court here is likely to find anything wrong with them legally. With all due respect, I come out on a different place on legal issues than Jacob does.
So let me ask you, should we eliminate, is your position to eliminate all of those limitations, or should we put fair limits on everybody, including the party structure?
Well, if there are going to be limits, it makes sense that they would be fair. But our position ideally would be that there should be no limits at all, because we support unlimited free speech for everyone. And money is what you use to speak. If you're an individual who wants to support a particular candidate, even if you're an ordinary citizen, you don't have lots of forums to get up and express your views. You don't have access to the op-ed page of the newspaper if you're an ordinary person. You don't have access to TV time. So what do if you want to get the word out about your candidate? You can give money to let the candidate speak on your behalf. And people should be allowed to do that. And the First Amendment means they should be allowed to do it as much as they want.
No, the First Amendment, with all due respect, does not mean that. And the basic error that my friend Jacob has made is this. The First Amendment is a tool designed to inform the public, so the public, the majority of the public, can vote intelligently on issues. That is why the First Amendment is key to our democracy. But when you turn the First Amendment on its head, the way that people who want unlimited amounts of money in politics do, what you are doing is perverting that system, so that rather than everybody having equal speech opportunities, rich people have far disproportionate impact and influence on politicians and on policies. That is in the view of not just current commentators, but actually in the views of some of our founding fathers. That corrupts that system, because it takes legislators' interests, and instead of being concerned with what the majority of the people in their district or their voting area care about. It makes them more concerned with what the majority of the funders care about. And that is a perversion and corruption of the interest that James Madison said should not be permitted.
Well, I definitely don't agree with that idea of what the First Amendment is about. The First Amendment is not a tool to achieve some particular goal set by the government. The First Amendment is a protection of the people's liberties. It's a protection of a fundamental right that we all have that precedes the existence of our government to speak as much as we want using our own property. And it's not just some tool to achieve some end. That's a modern progressive idea. That's not the Founding Fathers' idea of what liberty was about. Liberty was you get to do as much as you want without government interference unless the government has a really good reason to not let you do it. And free speech was an area where they told the government to keep their hands off completely. And of course, we didn't have campaign finance laws in the early days of the Republic, or at all until the past 40 years or so. Until then, people could give as much money as they wanted, and the sky did not fall.
Actually, Jacob's got his facts wrong on 2 scores there. First, campaign finance has been a problem. That was the reason we first encountered this problem in the 19th century when campaigns were funded by politicians handing out federal jobs and then the job holders having to pay taxes that were used to pay to fund campaigns. That led to the adoption of the civil service system and the civil service reforms in the 19th century. And during the progressive era in the early 20th century, it led to prohibitions on corporations contributing money to federal candidates. It led to the first set of campaign finance limits in the 1920s. Now, the more fundamental error that Jacob has made, however, isn't saying that the Founding Fathers only cared about the right to speak and that it was unattached to anything else. The right to speak, the free speech is critical to our government because it guarantees that no matter how small a minority or how large a minority you are, you have the right to put your argument into the debate of ideas and have it be fairly heard. It is heard then in electoral context under our democratic republic. And when you can convince a majority of the people, the legislator who's elected by those people is supposed to be responsive to the majority of those people. Right now, the system we have requires that before candidates can even go to the majority of the people who get votes, they have to go through a pre-election where they have to get approval from a set number of special interests, very rich people essentially, or very rich corporations, before they can even effectively run. That's a problem that is corrupting our democratic republic at its core. And it's not just me saying this, and it's not just one set of people on the left saying this. This is actually a bipartisan issue, and Larry Lessig, who's written about this, has made it a point to stress that this is a bipartisan issue and to demonstrate that in his writings, such as Lester Land and Republic Lost.
Well, I agree that campaign finance limits are a bipartisan issue. They are supported by politicians of both parties, and they're especially supported by incumbent politicians in both parties because incumbents are who benefit from campaign finance laws. If you're an incumbent, you love it if how much people can contribute to candidates is limited, because a challenger is going to be hurt a lot more by that than you are, because a challenger, he needs to have people know his name, he has to, and what he stands for, and he has to generate all of his publicity himself, and he has to raise all the money to do that. If you're an incumbent politician, you have the ability, by your office, you are already famous. By your office, you can travel around the state and make your name known and tout your accomplishments. And you can send things to your constituents, and you can do all sorts of things without raising money at all. So if you can limit everybody, that's great for incumbent politicians. That's why they voted this system in Illinois. Do you think that Mike Madigan and John Cullerton just are crusaders for reform, and they care about special interests being quashed and this sort of thing? The record otherwise doesn't suggest so. The reason they support these things is because it helps them, and that's why they designed it so they can give as much money as they want. And while there are, good government types who believe that these campaign contributions help fight special interests, in fact, they serve special interests by protecting incumbent politicians and by making it so that if you aren't connected to the political party machine, you are almost certainly going to be kept out unless you're a rich person who can fund your own campaign. So the political parties do well, rich people who can fund themselves do well, and everybody else in the middle is left out.
Jacob's a little wrong on that. Where he's got the point wrong is this. As our founding fathers recognized, and there are many examples of this in our Constitution, one of the chief, if not the chief threat to liberty long term is an undue concentration of power in any one entity or branch of government. That's why we have a division of powers among the branches of government. That's why we have divisions of powers between the president and the Congress and so on. Now, what happens when you have no limits is power gets unduly concentrated in those very rich people that we have in this, what I'm calling our second Gilded Age in the United States, who can essentially drown out all the other people by buying politicians. And the basic problem here is that we have a system in which politicians, in order to run for increasingly expensive offices, have to essentially make a decision. They have to either sell their soul to special interests to raise the money they need for their campaigns, and they have to do that whether they're incumbents or challengers, or they have to self-fund, which means only a handful of rich people are going to be eligible to run for office. Now, I don't think either of those systems is what the Founding Fathers had in mind when we set up this country. In fact, I'm quite sure of it, having looked at some of the Federalist Papers on this.
Before we continue the discussion, you made reference to Gilded Age, and historically, we should probably remind you that the first Gilded Age was in the late 1800s. That was with Rockefeller, with Carnegie, with Vanderbilts, et cetera. And so you're calling this the second Gilded Age?
I am calling this the second Gilded Age.
Let's move on. We know that we don't know what the definition of free speech is now so far, and we know, at least there's a disagreement. But we've been talking about money from outside sources. If I want to support your campaign or your campaign, whether there's a limit or not, it's my money going to you to run. What about Bruce Rauner? When a man comes in, made $53 million last year, he dumped approximately $6 million of his own money and had some other friends who dumped large amounts into the race. Doesn't that taint the electoral process that he has almost an unlimited pool of money to call upon?
Well, as I said a minute ago, this campaign finance system that we have makes it more likely that self-funded candidates like that will run, because if you're a political outsider and you're not able to reach out to a whole bunch of donors like someone tied into the political establishment is, you have no real options for raising money, because you can't go to, say, a handful of wealthy people and get sponsors to give you a lot of money because of the limits. You have to go to a whole lot of people, and if you're not connected to the political machine, you can't do that. So the only people who can break through are people who can fund themselves, because the Supreme Court has said you can spend as much money as you want on your own campaign. There's nothing anybody can do about that. I don't think that we should feel particularly threatened by that. After all, if you're funding yourself, at least no one can say you're beholden to some other special interest group that funded you. At least you can say, well, this is the guy who's been providing the money. We know what his business interests are. We know what his background is, and we can think about what those interests might be and how that might affect his positions in deciding whether we want to vote for him. So at least it's pretty clear what the person stands for, and that they're not doing anybody else's bidding. If they're funding themselves, you got to say that. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I don't think it's the case that rich people can buy elections. We know that because there's plenty of rich people who wanted to be president or in some other office and failed. Ross Perot couldn't buy the presidency. Steve Forbes couldn't buy the presidency. I doubt there's any amount of money for which Donald Trump could buy the presidency. And so you can't just buy elections, no matter how much money you have.
You may not be able, it's true that you cannot guarantee that you can buy an election. However, money is the single most important factor in determining whether you're going to have a successful campaign or not. And any politician of either party will tell you that. They all know that. If you don't have enough money, your campaign does not have a chance. That's a very simple fact of life. Now, the problem we have is counting on special interest to fund our elections. By definition, that requires our politicians to sell their souls to special interests. We, as a public that want democracy and believe in democracy, need to be willing to subsidize those elections by creating some sorts of systems. We personally favor a small donor matching system, so that the politicians essentially are beholden, again, to the interests of the general public, not to the interests of a few members of the wealthiest members of society, which is the system that we're headed at if we don't have any limits. Now, The limit system is only one way to solve this problem, and as Jacob has indicated, the Supreme Court over the last 10 years, a 5-member majority of that court, has made it increasingly difficult to use the system that was first adopted during the 1970s after the Watergate problems. So we do have to look in other directions. In my personal opinion, public financing is one of those directions that we need to very seriously explore, so the politicians do not have to sell their souls to special interests in order to run campaigns.
Well, I take exception to this idea that politicians all sell their souls. Now, I don't think very highly of a lot of politicians, but I don't know that they don't sincerely hold the positions they take. Consider, Governor Pat Quinn, for example, gets lots and lots of money from the public employee unions. Has he sold his soul to them? I don't think so. I think he probably already was sympathetic to their point of view, and therefore the money goes to him from those interests. It doesn't necessarily mean that. We don't have much evidence that there are many politicians who actually go against what they personally think because they've been bought by somebody or other. What happens is interest groups give money to the candidates that they believe tend to hold their values and will vote the way they want. As for this public financing idea, I don't think taxpayers should be forced to fund campaigns. For one, taxpayers are already stretched pretty thin with all the other spending the government does. The government can't afford the spending it does now, and so it's not reasonable to expect taxpayers to now also shell out for campaigns. And taxpayers shouldn't be forced to pay for speech they don't actually support. I don't want my candidate going, or excuse me, I don't want my money going to much of any candidates at all. But if we have a public financing system, you take my money and give it to people who are doing it to espouse ideas or candidates that I don't support. I don't think that's a good thing.
With all due respect, Jacob has completely mischaracterized the way public financing systems work. And he's raised a lot of specious objections to them, none of which hold water. I don't want to take the time to try and go answer everything he said, but suffice to say there are good logical answers to everything he said that show that basically his objections to them are all wet. You don't have to, you're not being asked to finance any particular candidates. There are ways you can use voucher systems so you can direct where your money goes as a citizen. The basic problem, though, is that we have a system in which it's increasingly expensive to run for office, and increasingly politicians are forced to sell their souls. Now, that doesn't mean that necessarily on their top issues 1 through 5, they're going to change and disregard their conscience. But on issues 6 through 1,000, it will impact their judgment. And you can ask any politician that. The fact that politicians have to now spend between 30 and 60% of their time raising money and rather than legislating or dealing with their constituents shows the magnitude of the problem that we have today.
Actually, I mean, the reason if they have to spend so much time raising money, it may be because they have to get so many different donations from so many different people because the amounts limited are small. If you could go to a smaller pool of somewhat bigger donors, you wouldn't have to spend so much time raising money.
Well, so what I hear Jacob saying is we should leave government to the rich people in this country because they're the ones who can afford it and they're the ones who should be able to direct what happens. I don't agree with that view of democracy. I believe that it is votes that count, not dollars.
I agree that it's votes that count. And at the end of the day, everybody has one vote. I don't know about anyone else in this table or watching this, but nobody can buy my vote. At the end of the day, it's up to my conscience. And I sort through all the information that I can, and I make the decision. And no amount of money in politics is going to change that.
Let's turn to, go ahead, real quickly.
Here's the thing. Money does affect voters' actions, particularly those voters who may not have voting in the election as their highest priority in their personal life, which is many people.
I want to get to one other topic before our time runs out, and that is money in judicial races. We know that the Illinois State Supreme Court, you run for that particular position. You run for retention. Judges at the circuit level run for retention. They're appointed first, and then they run for retention. So what's wrong with, just like any other race?
Well, most of the public, the vast majority of the public has consistently recognized the problem with forcing judges to go out and raise money to run campaigns. Judges are not elected representatives, and they're not representing anyone except they're representing the general public in making sure that justice is being done. So it is a little odd to be electing judges to begin with, and that's why we have an appointment system at the federal level. That's why the Founding Fathers decided on that for the federal system. Now, in states, as in Illinois, most state judges, a lot of them are elected. The people want that because they want to check on judicial power, which I understand and am sympathetic to. The problem is the public's interest never really effectively gets down to voting intelligently on judges. And as a result, we have lots of dysfunctional systems where what you're really testing is not the judge's qualifications. You're testing their ability to raise money and put out a campaign that persuades a majority of largely uninformed voters.
I don't know what in particular to respond to in that. I think judicial elections are important so that the people do have a check on who's running things. And the alternative is, of course, having some politically privileged group, whether the governor or some group of people, select who our judges will be. And so while we can see disadvantages to both, while we can see disadvantages to elections, we should also recognize that there would be disadvantages to any alternative to that. As for judges taking money to run their campaigns, of course, if any judge takes money from someone who ends up before him in court, he could have to recuse himself as a result of that. The Supreme Court had a decision a few years ago that said there are some circumstances where the Constitution requires a judge to recuse himself if too much money has been spent on his behalf in a particular election. And so we have a way to deal with that. It's judges recusing themselves.
Well, except that case that Jacob refers
10
to
seconds.
was known as was a highly unusual case, and in most cases, it's left to the judges as to whether they should recuse themselves.
And we haven't even gotten to the McCutcheon versus the Federal Election Commission. We haven't talked about a lot of different things. But I hope what this has done is given you some fuel for discussion in your own home. Let me say thank you to both of you very much for coming from Chicago for this discussion. It's been very enlightening. Thank you very much to Dave Melton, who's the Executive Director of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform, and to Jacob Huebert, who's the lead attorney for the Liberty Justice Center in Chicago.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
with that, let me remind you that we'll be back in 2 weeks. We have the auction coming up next week here on WTVP, but in 2 weeks, we'll be back to talk about the problem with the shrinking population in rural communities. Is that really a death knell? We'll have some people who think otherwise on the next At Issue in 2 weeks.